Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is D-Talks. Today I'm going to be talking to Tom Lloyd, co-founder of design studio Pearson Lloyd. Tom, welcome to the series.
A great pleasure.
Thank you very much for being here. My first question is, as an individual so committed to sustainable and circular design, what specific aspects of Design Declares align with your vision for Pearson Lloyd?
I think it all does. I mean, it's you've done a very good job of unpicking what it means to change your behaviour in response to the climate emergency, and going through the act in the last few days, thinking about this interview. All of it becomes an important part of the process, and there are stages that you need to do and behave and change in response to the climate emergency.
Or, and for instance, when you signed up, and now that you've declared a climate emergency, has that influenced the approach the Pearson Lloyd team has taken to projects?
It has, and it's not. I think it was we would the design declares thing was very much mirroring what we were doing already, but I think the it has created a lens through which you can be much more precise about how you act. I think we have two quite different places that we're trying to develop. One is a narrative out to the industry, and we're speaking a lot and trying to create and develop our own sense of communicating with the industry to as a sort of collective approach. And the other one is much more classical sort of relationships with our clients.
And what about you personally? What drives your motivation to do, to aim for sustainable design, and how does that influence how you approach your projects in particular?
I think it starts with an ethical perspective. I think maybe it does for all of us. It's not, we have to think about our children and our grandchildren, and we can see, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, there's a palpable sense of climate change now. We're living in it. I think 10 years ago, it was in a way speculative because you couldn't quite see the change. I think now we can really feel the change. I'm co-responsible for the production of lots of carbon in my profession, and I want to make sure that every ounce of carbon is responsibly managed.
Has that been sort of a key part of implementing the principles of the 8 Design Declares Acts into the sort of work at Pearson Lloyd?
I think it's a lot of it is about upskilling. It's about changing the skill sets you need to make the different types of decision. I think in the past design was a classically delivered profession where you thought about form and function, market, price, whether something was attractive or useful, but you didn't think about impact. I think impact from a planetary perspective is a relatively new part of the profession.
Focusing on impact and trying to take that as a new measurement. I mean, through the design process, how are you balancing the needs of your users and the needs of your clients with those new planetary needs that are now being considered?
I think design has always been about balance. And I think if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, social, environmental, and economic balance, that trilogy exists perfectly within our design profession. Because clearly we're still, unless you're designing for public sector or for the social sector, there's always a commercial imperative, or there's always an imperative around whether something is going to work commercially. Is it affordable? Is there going to be some sort of return, whether it's a social return or an economic return? You're always having to balance that. I think we have just one more stakeholder, which is the planet, which is much more overt in our design process.
I mean, now that given that complexity or that added layer of complexity, when you're taking on projects with clients, how do you frame the benefits of sustainable design choices like distributed manufacturing or design for repairability to a client that might still want to focus on cost and convenience?
I think at the end of the day, let's just stay with the sort of commercial sector, if you like, people who are there to make a living from making stuff. They all at the end of the day have to fulfill a market need and a market demand. And if the demand, and they also have to comply with the regulatory framework. And I think the two parts of those two parts of user demand and regulations and the legal framework means they can't avoid changing their behavior, because they'll slowly just cut themselves out from the users who now demand higher standards of sustainable development. Will start to drift away. And if they come up against the ceiling of what the law is asking them to do, they will also begin to damage their business. So actually, it's not really, cost and convenience aren't really anymore the metrics of success.
Do you find that now when you've got clients coming to you, do more of them come with a sort of including that in the brief, or is that something more that you guys still have to sort of say, hey, let's also approach it with this bit in mind?
I think we have to be honest, we have the full spectrum of clients, from clients who are much more ambitious than us, and we're like having to catch up and stay in touch with the benchmarks that they're setting, and other clients who are still in a very, in a way, old world culture, and we're having to chip away and say, by the way, have you, what about this? Have you thought about this? Should, can we do this? And so you have to, in any client relationship, you have to fit into the culture of the space of change that they can cope with. Because if you're too ambitious in terms of change, you'll break the relationship, and then it will effectively collapse. So we can only ever innovate or develop change within the metrics of that relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. And like after having signed up to Design Declares and sort of taking on board the principles behind those, the 8 acts, has that, like, which of those has been sort of the easiest to implement across the process at Pearson Lloyd, and which one requires a bit more sort of strategic innovation and client alignment?
That's a good question. I think there are very few common standards in this new space. So measurement, for example, I think it's aligning a common set of metrics around how you judge whether something is good or bad, high or low. In our industry or in our sector, circularity and carbon are two very different things. That's not only us, but you can measure carbon quite accurately in a sense. Circularity is a much more subjective idea, but in principle, you're trying to minimize the amount of carbon being used for whatever and maximize its lifespan through circularity. Now, each of those have their own set of metrics that you can judge the success of a product by, but the next business or the next part of the industry might have a different set of metrics. So it's still apples and pears a bit.
Yeah,
I think we find that we have to act in a way on our own. Can't wait for legislation to change, and we're not always going to get the right metrics from our clients. So you have to sort of upskill in yourself, and then just drive the change from that perspective.
I remember at one of at the first Design Declares event, you gave a talk about how you guys have gone about implementing, I think it's Act 4, which is measure what you make. Was that the sort of one which you guys felt that you could make real progress on? Because I remember you were using all sorts of resources and stuff to track the carbon of your product. Is that now part of a bigger sort of LCA approach to how you approach the projects that you design?
I think carbon is probably in a way the easiest, although within any carbon calculator, whether it catches the whole from the ground, from the mining process to the consumption, is still unclear. And I think depending on which data you use, they're a bit hard to judge. I think some of the choices we're making are much more about the source material, if it's recycled material or it's virgin material. For example, aluminium has a sort of 10 times difference between virgin aluminium and recycled aluminium. In the old days, we would just think about how efficient a product was in terms of material consumption, which was good, but we didn't think about its source, where that material is coming from. And so the supply chain and the material choices have a massive impact on the measurement process. So we're having to stretch out our understanding of how a product comes to market in order to make better choices.
Have you found, and this is something I'm always curious about, is that now that you've started making these choices and making these decisions around how you design a product and understanding the material first stuff, has that, are you now starting to sort of see sort of economies of scale of making those sustainable choices, or are they still at the point where it's still more expensive, it's still more difficult to implement those things? Or have you seen that as we've gone through the process that it's actually become easier and more accessible to implement these better sustainable principles into projects?
I've never thought that sustainability has a cost. There's a cost barrier to sustainability. I think it's a myth.
Excellent. Good. I'm really glad to
I think
hear that.
making choices about how much material you use in a thing doesn't have to be that's not a there's no penalty to that. There might be a penalty to using a bio resin rather than a polyurethane, but actually those things are closing in, and as the market increases for recycled supply chains of plastics, for example, clearly that cost barrier will change.
Bringing it back to design declares, because this is just my last question for you now, is now that you've been part of design declares for quite some time and quite an integral part of it, what would you like to see emphasized more by design declares and by extension of that, the design community and sector as a whole?
Clearly, we need to act now. I think sometimes both client side and on the sort of design side, people are reluctant to start because they don't think they have enough knowledge. And I think people should be encouraged to start anyway, because you can always I think we can get from 100% to 50% really quickly. I think it's the 50 to 0 that's going to be the challenge. But I think people can get that first half of reduction and of improvement can happen really fast. But I think people just have to be encouraged to start. And also, I don't think we focus particularly on circularity and carbon. Within our LCA, we're just developing our LCA knowledge more specifically around toxicity, around biodiversity, and all these other bits that impact our decisions impact. But for us, actually, the classical position of an efficient product and a circular product are not that difficult to get your head around. But they do change the way you make decisions as a design process. And sometimes we're still struggling to. There are blockages in the road. Like polyurethane is still a major problem in the furniture industry. Laminates are a problem in the there are bits where it's difficult to see where the alternatives lie. But slowly, technologies and startups are emerging with alternative ways of allowing circularity in the system.
Is that something actually that you guys sort of explore? Is working, like reaching out and working with startups that are working in the sort of material world to say, how can we, is there a way that we can apply this material to it, or does that sort of come later on?
I think we have relationships with various sort of biomaterials, nature-based materials, and there's an interesting. This is a bit binary, but in principle, biomaterials have no circularity, but they're very low in carbon. So they're ground to ground in a way, which is great. So if you know something's not going to be recycled, then using a biomaterial is good. If you know something that might be mass produced and you want to recycle, then you need a supply chain for that recyclability to exist. So if you make a hemp chair, that hemp chair will never be used into something else because there isn't a supply chain for that material, for the recovery of that material. So there are very different choices to make around why and where. Actually, plastic is a very good material for lots of reasons, for lots of industries.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
But you can still make good choices around what plastic you use and why, and how it can then feed into a particular material reclamation process. Polyester is a really good material. Polypropylene is a good material, but if it doesn't have glass, there's all sorts of. And within our sector, you can be quite precise about why you make those choices, and what the benefits will be in the future.
I just want to bring it back to what you just said earlier. Is the whole start now thing? I think I'm with you. Like that's the biggest. That I think for a lot of people is the biggest barrier, because they might say, "Oh, we do agree with this. We do we do believe in it, but we still work with clients who aren't on that same journey as us, and we're worried that it'll feel greenwashy and disingenuous to the rest of the world that we say, oh, we believe in it, but we still choose to work with those clients. Is there something that you would want, that you think you would want to say to clients or to people to say, how would you get them to act now, or to?
I think
to take that journey?
we're in the same place. We work in the aviation sector. We work with still quite traditional manufacturers who are not able yet to make the change. Funny enough, the opportunity for change is greater in the dirtiest industries. So our view within aviation is it's better to be inside that tent fighting for improvement than just standing back and saying, ethically, I can't go near it.
Wash your hands of it.
And actually, I was in a conference 2 or 3 weeks ago about sustainable aviation fuel, and which is legitimately about 80% lower in carbon, because it's using animal waste, and it's using food stock waste and farming waste that are fermented to create the fuel.
Wow.
So it's already a waste material. It's above ground, so it's within a circular system. I mean, it's amazing. But that's about a 10% improvement in the overall aviation sort of industry. But so we are in that same place of we can't stand up and say everything is perfect, and we've got a long way to go. We did a recent calculation on our total annual carbon from our designs, and it's very high. It's thousands of tons of carbon. But it means that if in 10 years' time across one cycle, maybe we can halve that, that's thousands of tons less carbon that will be in one product cycle. So we do think we can have a big impact within our own sphere of influence.
Yeah, I think that's the best mindset to have, because I've come across people in this industry where they say, we can't commit to it because we can't make the change right away. But I think that's the wrong mindset to have, because it's not going to happen overnight. But acknowledging it and taking those steps and taking the first steps into it, many small changes will make a big wave, and I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. That really embraces that design to players ethos as well. Brilliant, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us today on the series. Really appreciate it.
Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.